Hello and welcome to a presentation on the origin of species by Charles Darwin. I'm John Paul D'Souza and I am assisted by
Nicholas Orgamary
and Rob Asaf.
First slide is just a brief summary of what this book was all about, and it's relatively self-explanatory.
It was a big deal at the time because it clashed with the conservative views of the people. And when I say the people, I refer to the general populace, and they had, for the most part, not wanting to generalize, a slightly religiously tinged view of creation and the purpose of man. And so what Darwin essentially presented with the origin of species was a new idea which was revolutionary.
Revolutionary and conflicting with established beliefs. Very interesting quote from the academic David Thompson, who is a recurring character within this presentation. And he does have some very good things to say on Mr. Darwin.
As you can see in the quote, Thompson highlights the beliefs of the Christians at the time. They took the Bible very literally.
And so now we're going to turn to look at the impact that this book had on society, on religion, and on the political aspect of the society. And it wasn't restricted to England, where the book was published. It did arouse international interest and sparked a widespread debate.
It's interesting, when analysing the impact that the publication of The Origin of Species had on society at large, there are at least 3 or 4 aspects into which the study of this debate might be divided. So as you can see here, you have scientific, ideological, social, and religious. And as we discussed before, the ideological and religious aspects of the people were closely intertwined.
And it is telling of the impact itself that the book had itself, that it could transcend the scientific realm within which it was published and have an effect on so many different spheres of society. It's obviously a brief look at the religious impact.
Once again, we have David Thompson in his book Europe Since Napoleon making a very insightful comment. And here he's talking about the fact that it challenged all existing creeds and philosophies, all notions of the origin, nature, and destiny of mankind. And obviously, when a book analyzes, or when any form of literature analyzes these so profound questions, the impact that this book has is going to be widespread and hard-hitting, and this is exactly what the book was.
Just a quick look at the scientific impact of the book. And first and foremost, it legitimized scientific discussions of evolutionary mechanisms and validated an investigation into exactly how evolution took place. And the legacy of the book remains today through the common use of the term Darwinism, and
which was coined by his contemporary Herbert Spencer, as were a number of terms which are commonplace today almost.
He actually wrote another book about that. It was called On the Origin of the Name.
As you can see here, in the mid-1870s, evolutionism was triumphant. But it's interesting to note that while a lot of people today take the two concepts of evolutionism and natural selection to be inherently combined and intertwined, it was in fact not until the 1930s and 40s, so a couple of decades later, that natural selection was taken seriously and as a viable scientific theory by the scientific kind of population at large. Here it is interesting to note that evolution through natural laws was a big focus of his work, and that his strategy, as it says here, established that evolution through natural laws was worthy of scientific study. And this was in direct conflict with the view held by many at the time, and a few liberal theologians of that time, Christian theologians especially, that there was a theory which reconciled evolution with God's creation, and we will see more of that later.
The social and political impacts of Darwin's work. It was pounced upon, in a sense, by leaders lobbying for social reform as a justification for their arguments, and it was adapted to suit their case and their end.
In addition, the people also, to use the word that my colleague here has used, pounced upon. They capitalized upon the fact that public journals were coming rapidly into a much wider publication, and so for that reason, a lot more people who represented the thought of the people, as opposed to just the leaders of the time, could give their opinion and give their input, and as such, the people became a very important part of this push for social reform associated with the publication of The Origin.
And then the reverse can be seen through Herbert Spencer, who argued that we should abandon the poor and abandon the disadvantaged and forget about any concept of a welfare state in favour of indeed survival of the fittest.
Alfred Russel Wallace, as you can see here, prominent British so-and-so, he argued that as opposed to just imitating nature and leaving survival of the fittest, another Spencerian term, no surprise, surprise, rather than leaving survival of the fittest to do its work, that we needed to take action. We needed a positive, proactive action to correct social and economic inequities, and we'll see why this is in a moment.
It's off his Tumblr.
Obviously an academic. There you go.
This, they argued, would level the playing field, and that is key.
It's funny, it was taken to the extent, this whole discussion was taken to the extent of an argument for competition between nations and between human races. And to think that, as my colleague mentioned before, it transcended the merely scientific realm to go to ideological, social, political discussions and levels, it is telling. It is telling just of the impact that it had as a whole. And these were pretty revolutionary ideas. Although a few historians made the comment that Walter Bagehot and people who proposed similar ideas had only a superficial understanding of Darwin's thoughts and Darwin's discoveries regarding natural selection. It's been commented by some that Hitler himself, in his promulgation of the Aryan nation and concepts like that, was influenced by Darwin and his theory of natural selection and survival of the fittest, coined by Spencer, remember. And yet, it's to be noted that On the Origin of Species was one of the books that Hitler burnt at the famous burning of the books.
In this slide, you can just see how it conflicted with the purpose in nature, as many people took the Genesis Bible passage as a literal meaning. When Darwin came out with this book, they took it as an attack. And many theologians prior to this actually knew that it wasn't a literal meaning. As it says here, it could be reconciled by theistic evolution. This was a certain compromise they came to in believing this.
And that was a view. That was a view who was supported by a contemporary and very close friend of Charles Darwin at the time, a certain Asa Gray, Asagray. He is considered one, perhaps the most important American botanist of the 19th century, and so that was his line. Obviously, he was a believer, and theistic evolution was something that he would often discuss with Darwin. But yes, this was a theory that he promulgated, and that's something interesting to.
And it has already been noticed within this presentation that the ideas of evolution that Darwin voiced within his novel were accepted within 10 years, and perhaps the increasing secularization of society and the move away from religion by many people was a factor in that.
As we've discussed, a number of the church fathers had not interpreted the Genesis narrative literally, as a literal account of God's creation of man 6,000 or so years ago, and yet, as we will see here, defense of the argument from design and natural theology was central to debates over the book in the English-speaking world. And what this is trying to say is essentially that regardless of whether or not the account was literal, this theory propounded by Darwin in his book seemed to suggest that nature was a law unto itself.
In addition, mental and moral qualities are seen as spiritual aspects of the immaterial soul, and it was believed that animals did not have spiritual qualities.
And that's something that explains the reaction of incredulosity that people had to this concept that they were once animals. So that's sort of vindicating their approach.
And this is just a funny picture regarding the conflict between the purely scientific and empiricist view of man's powers of reasoning and thinking as residing in the brain, and this was in, well, it appeared to be in contrast, as this picture suggests, with the theory that man's powers of reasoning, of ratiocination, were bound up and performed by his immaterial soul, created by God. Darwinism had great effects on 19th century thought, because it was yet another wonderful new synthesis. Darwinism was the supreme achievement of contemporary trends towards synthesis, and the publication of The Origin of Species made the year 1859 a turning point in modern science and philosophy.
Charles Darwin lived in Down House until he died in 1882. He continued walking, thinking, writing papers and books. He finally tackled the touchy subject of human evolution in a book called The Descent of Man. But none of his later works would match the impact of Origin of Species. In a very real sense, that book gave us the world.